You may or may not be able to hear my dog snoring at the moment. We'll just call it cute background noise. Hey whoever's out there, I go by Grumblebug and I am currently reading Not Your Sidekick by C.B. Lee. My plan for this video had been to go through all the books that I read in July, but then I realized that I read 23 books last month. Half of those were graphics based, so comics, graphic novels, etc. But still, I would like to talk about each of them for more than maybe a minute a piece. So I'm gonna break this up into a couple different parts just to make it easier on, well, everybody. In this video, I will wrap up the fantasy novels and novellas that I read. I'm going to put timestamps down in the description, so check that out if you're interested in a particular book or want to skip around. It occurs to me that there's probably going to be a glare on my glasses throughout this, but I'm using a script, so sorry. I was going to say that we'll start with a bang, but in thinking about it, I think smolder might be a more appropriate word for this book, and that is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I touched on this in my mid-year freakout tag. I promise not to repeat myself too much from that video, but there I dubbed it my most disappointing read of the year so far. Let me clarify though, just because I was disappointed does not mean that I disliked it. I am glad that I finally read this book. Let me explain. So The Night Circus tells the story of a magic circus, the surreal experiences that patrons and performers have there, and the decades-long rivalry between two characters who have been pitted against one another in a competition of showmanship and kind of one-upmanship. The writing is atmospheric and dreamlike, and the full story unfolds over multiple timelines that we transition back and forth between. The thing is that on paper, this book had all the makings of a favorite for me, and maybe that was the problem, honestly. Maybe my expectations were just too high, because I went in really expecting to fall in love. And while there were elements that I certainly enjoyed, overall, I personally felt kind of lukewarm. The world and the magic of this story are interesting, and our cast of characters are a really interesting lineup, no two are the same. The whole plot sort of slowly unfolds, and forgive the metaphor, but looking back on my reading experience, I kind of equate it to taking a piece of origami, just bear with me, okay, I'm going somewhere with this, that has been unfolded into the original square paper. As I was reading, I felt like I could see all of those lines and creases across the paper that would ultimately go into the final shape of the product. But I really had no idea what that full picture was going to look like until everything was finally pulled together at the very, very end. Fitting all these pieces together kept me intrigued, and the magic remains fairly mysterious and abstract as we go, which isn't always my favorite approach personally, but I feel like it works really well with the dreamlike quality of this book as a whole. It fits. But despite all that, I just never really gained momentum with this book. I was never drawn into the story in such a way that I was really compelled to keep going. I had to consciously make sure that I kept going back and picking it up so I could finish. I personally found it difficult to keep tabs on where we were in history at any given time because we do go back and forth, and we're not always sure, or I wasn't always sure, what I was seeing when I saw it. I wonder if that would have been easier if I had stuck with reading a physical copy of the book rather than alternating between physical e-reader and audiobook, but I felt like I had to use all those mediums just to finish, just to keep going. The year is stamped at the header of each chapter, so the author does definitely make an effort to make sure you know where you are. I feel like if I had been able to flip back and forth between the chapters as I went, it would have been easier to keep my bearings, absolutely. And that may have absolutely impacted my experience reading the story, so keep that in mind if you decide to pick this up. Maybe physical is the way to go if that's an option. If you're looking for something with a very languid, gradual pace to it, something that is transportive and really embodies the type of magic that relies on a sense of wonder and not so much a concrete system of rules that you will ever really understand, this might be a great book for you. Just know that you have to go in ready to really give yourself over and just go along for the ride without questioning too much. You have to be comfortable not necessarily knowing what is actually happening or why it's happening or how it all fits together until the very, very end. The next book that I'll touch on was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. This felt so timely given the recent dialogue in the United States surrounding police brutality and systemic racism. But to me, the ultimate point of this book was that those are conversations that we should always be having, no matter how much change or progress seems to have been made. Pet takes place in what is basically a utopia. Evil has been eradicated. There is no abuse, no prejudice, no discrimination. There is no child neglect or sexual assault or malicious violence or abuse of power. The ills of mankind and the monsters who perpetrated them have been rooted out by what the people refer to as angels, dedicated leaders who ushered in a new age of peace and equality, shaping the world into the safe, humane society that we're introduced to in this story. Our protagonist is Jam, who is a young girl, and her existence and identity and the fact that no one questions or challenges either of those things are an immediate illustration of just how far society has come. Jam is a transgender girl. She is selectively mute, and she uses sign language to communicate with most of her community. These traits do not define her, they're simply parts of her, and they've been embraced by her family and society as a whole without question. It's beautiful, honestly, and the experiences that she's had growing up really help us to understand just how different her world is from the one that we live in today. But one evening, Jam accidentally encounters a creature named Pet. Pet has come to this town because there is a monster lurking within it, which is not supposed to be possible. But that monster is here, and it is apparently somewhere inside Jam's best friend's home. This book looks at the ways in which people can be so desperate to believe that monsters aren't real, that the evils of the world have been purged, and that the sins of the past are dead and gone, that we blind ourselves to the monsters that walk among us, alive and well, but hidden in plain sight. This was beautifully written and an engrossing story that does so much in just over 200 pages. I also want to point out the representation seen in this book. I already mentioned that Jam is transgender, selectively mute, and communicates using sign. Jam is also Black, and there are very concrete elements of her culture and ethnicity throughout this book. Like Jam's gender identity, race and ethnicity are never singled out as a distinguishing factor between people in this story. It's just a facet of the people that we get to know in this world. We also get insight into a very healthy polyamorous marriage, one member of which is non-binary, and Akwaeke Emezi himself is a non-binary author. I can't wait to pick up Emezi's new release, The Death of Vivek Oji, which just came out this month, because of how impacted I was by this story and what a wonderful experience I had reading it. All right, let's break up the heavy stuff a little bit and talk about one of the middle grade fantasy books that I picked up. While looking for a more lighthearted escape from the world, I stumbled upon The Dragon with a Chocolate Heart by Stephanie Burgis. Our protagonist is named Aventurine, which, fun fact, is a type of quartz. I learned that while reading this. She is a young dragon at a very frustrating place in her life. On the one hand, she's too young to join the older dragons of her family in their hunts beyond the cave that they live in, but she's also yet to find a passion to spend all this downtime pursuing, which is what's expected of a dragon at this age. They typically take up some kind of, it seems like, scholarly pursuit, like poetry or philosophy, but Aventurine is just not interested in any of that. The gist is that Aventurine sneaks out of the cave, encounters a human who turns out to be a food mage, gets turned into a human girl, which is super annoying for her. But at the same time, she is introduced to chocolate, which she immediately realizes is her passion. I mean, I can relate. Going home to her family is not an option, so instead, Aventurine finds her way into a nearby city, where she wrangles herself an apprenticeship with a chocolatier at a struggling chocolate house. The dragon-turned-girl quickly finds herself entangled in a mess of social politics that she could not care less about, and God do I love her for that. All she wants to do is learn how to make chocolate from her master chocolatier, who has a temper that's about as short as a dragon's is. Maybe I was reading too much into things, that's very possible, but I thought this was a really sweet book with some quiet but pretty consistent messages about empowerment. Aventurine struggles as a human girl because she knows that there is a fierce, capable, literal dragon inside of her just begging to get back out. But no one else is willing to see that. They just see this misfit, headstrong girl who's not doing anything quite the way that they expect her to. There are also some themes of dealing with the world and people in particular who insist that you're helpless, that you don't fit in, and that your dreams are foolish, and overall that you're just not enough. We ultimately get themes of following your dreams and knowing that you are enough, regardless of whether you're doing things the conventional way. Aventurine's best friend is an equally kick-butt girl, but for different reasons, who has no interest in letting social expectations dictate what she wears, how she does things, or what she's capable of doing. That friend is the protagonist in the sequel, which is sitting right up there, actually, on my library checkout shelf, so I'll be picking that up pretty soon. This was cute and heartwarming. It was a nice palate cleanser, so to speak, in the middle of some much heftier things that I was reading in the month of July. On that note, let's get back to some of the heavier stuff. Quick note here, I'm about to discuss The Deep by River Solomon. If you're not aware, this book centers on themes and historical elements from the atrocities committed against African people during the slave trade. If it's not something that you're comfortable hearing about, by all means, please go ahead and skip to the next book. I'll put the time marker somewhere. Next up, I want to talk about The Deep by River Solomon. I discussed this one as well in my mid-year freakout tag as one of the best books that I have read so far in 2020. I'll give you a heads up now that this will probably be the longest part of the video, but again, I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much from the mid-year tag. This book tells the story of the Wajenru, who are a sea-dwelling people descended from pregnant African women who were killed during the slave trade. These women were thrown overboard into the Atlantic by slavers while being transported from their homes to the United States. We specifically follow Yetu, who acts as the historian of her people. The Wajenru have a painful history full of the trauma they were born from, and they seem to have adapted by storing very little of their own memories as individuals. Instead, Yetu and the historians who came before her have acted as vessels for their entire respective generations. They contain their people's entire history, collecting memories from all the individual Wajenru and passing them down from vessel to vessel. So this is how Yetu's people keep their collective memory and experiences. Plot-wise, we follow Yetu as both she and her people struggle to balance their relationship with the past. Yetu, as historian, has really been asked to sacrifice her own well-being and quality of life in order to bear this burden of her people's collective memory. Now, let's acknowledge upfront that there is a cultural component here regarding the experience of African Americans that I am not the right person to talk about. If you are interested in that, I highly encourage you to check out the live show that Ashley over at Bookish Realm, who I love, hosted for this book, where she and some fellow booktubers discussed this novella and the significance that it held for them as Black women and the culture that they identify with. I will put a link to that down in the description. For my part, personally, I was really impacted by how this story explored trauma. I talked at decent length about this in that freakout tag video, but the gist is that as someone training to go into the mental health field, I was really impressed at all the nuances and complexities that Solomon dives into here. There's an impactful portrayal of the impact that trauma has on individuals, on communities, on generations and cultures as a whole. We also look at the very complex relationship that many people have with their own trauma. It is a burden, it is painful, and it's consuming, but it can also hold a kind of power in how we understand ourselves and who we are. If that's a train of thought that you're interested in hearing more about, you can check out that video I did. I'll link to it below, but definitely do go check out the live show I mentioned over on Bookish Realm. They dive into a great discussion of cultural trauma that I personally found really engaging. The writing style of this is pretty abstract. I personally would call it atmospheric because it made me feel like I was underwater. There's this feeling of drifting along the currents of the memories that Yetu holds as they ebb and flow from her consciousness. It's not always clear where or when we are or whose perspective we're getting, but to me, that worked really well with the story as an artifact of all this history that Yetu contains. It also added to the sense of how diffuse the boundaries were between the past and the present, and between a person's community and themselves. If that doesn't sound like your kind of thing, no shame, that's cool, but fair warning, know what you're getting into with this. Here are my main takeaways. If you're looking to read about mermaids, specifically, because you enjoy that kind of whimsical idea of people who live under the sea, and the magic that pop culture often associates with that kind of mythos, don't pick up this book just for mermaids, okay, please. That's just my opinion, personally, but I saw a lot of reviews on Goodreads from people who did that. They wanted to read about mermaids, and they picked this up, and not only were they often disappointed, but they often faulted the author and the book for not giving them the Little Mermaid-esque story that they were looking for. Yes, this book is set among a merfolk populace, but this book to me is not about mermaids. It's not really about its plot either, though that does exist. There is a plot, I promise. I feel like it was more about those relationships between people and culture and the past, and the things that we carry with us, for better or worse. But again, I am one person. This was just my takeaway from the story. In terms of representation, gender and sexuality are pretty fluid among Yetu's people. It seems to be less about biology or anatomy and more about identity, which I thought was really cool. I also felt like through Yetu's experience of the sheer emotional burden she carries on behalf of her people and how physically overwhelming that is, I felt like there was room to infer some either sensory processing issues of some kind or otherwise just an all-consuming, very physical form of empathy. But again, that is just my interpretation as a reader. That is not formally discussed anywhere by the author that I know of. River Solomon themselves, the author, is Black and non-binary, so keep that in mind as you consider the cultural context of this story. My final note is that you should definitely read the author's note. In my opinion, maybe before you read the actual novella. In my copy, it was in the back of the book, so I didn't find it until I was almost finished, but once I did, it added a whole other layer to things. It gives you the artistic context of this story, which is truly a collaborative work. Solomon wrote the novella, but it is based on a song by the same name, which is really a short story in its own right. That song was created by the hip-hop group Clipping. Yes, that group does include Daveed Diggs, who was in Hamilton. He narrates the audiobook. It's fantastic. Listen to it while you read if you can. I got it through Libby. Clipping song was itself inspired by the collected works of a musical duo called Dexciya. Dexciya created this entire concept of a world and a people descended from those pregnant women killed during the slave trade's Middle Passage, which the Deep, both the song and the novella, they have the same title, are based on. The creative interconnections between all of these works was fascinating to me, and I felt like it really added an extra layer to the sense of history that we get as something that is constantly evolving and is a collective process that is passed down across generations and throughout cultures. But then again, I'm a geek and I read into things, so take that with a grain of salt. If it's not already clear, this was a lot. I was blown away. I want to read it again, and I'm confident that I will take something new from the Deep with each reread. And also each listen, because I now play the Clipping song, The Deep, on repeat. I want to finish off by talking about another middle grade. So the final book that I'll discuss in this video was The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. This book gave me that magical, transportive experience that I've been really enjoying from middle grade fantasy lately. In many ways, this feels like a classic fairy tale, but in others, it's subversive in a way that was unexpected but a lot of fun. We start off believing this is a story about an evil witch who demands tribute from a village in the form of children that they're forced to sacrifice to her each year, keeping this town enshrouded in fear and really despair, basically. We very quickly learn, like on page 3, that the villains in this story have a more modern flair and motivations, I would say, and that evil is a lot harder to spot in this world than fairy tales would typically lead us to believe. Rescued from the woods where she was left as one of those sacrifices, baby Luna is saved and adopted by the wicked old witch, who's really not wicked at all. Luna's adoptive grandmother accidentally feeds her moonlight as a baby, which imbues her with a powerful magic, the kind that is straight out of a fairy tale and has so much potential and whimsy to it, but really isn't all that safe or practical in the hands of a small child, which is something they have to deal with. This is a multi-perspective story in which we follow Luna as she grows up with her grandmother and their small, accumulated family in the woods. Meanwhile, though, we also get to watch the neighboring town that Luna came from as it slowly starts to wake up and recognize that the real villains live among them rather than out in the woods. This is a story about how love is its own kind of magic, and wicked people thrive on the sorrow of others. There's a tiny dragon who is a whole lot bigger than he looks, and a wise swamp monster who is older than the world itself, but is still moved by poetry and the love that he has for his found family. This was beautiful. I don't have a better word for it, and I cannot wait to read it again. I know it might seem from this video that I reread books a lot, but I really don't. That's not the case. That said, I do fully expect to purchase my own copy of this book. Well, sometime when I haven't just had to buy fall textbooks. That covers the fantasy novels and novellas that I read this July. Stay tuned for the rest of my July reads in the next few days, where I'll talk about the contemporary and historical books I read, as well as several comics, graphic novels, and my very first foray into manga. If you're interested in any of that, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up for me, and I will leave you with a question to think about. What kind of details, if any, I guess, do you look for from book reviews? My natural inclination, as you can probably tell if you made it to the end of this video, is to give a little bit of setup, but then go into my big takeaways as the reader and the themes that I felt were really prominent, things that aren't spoilers per se, but that you maybe won't get just from reading the summary. What do you guys think? What does the perfect Goldilocks book review look like to you? Let me know your thoughts. I'm really curious. Tell me what you think down in the comments. Thanks so much for hanging out. I hope you read something great today, and I will see you when I see you.